Companies can be financially devastated if they get hit with a large liability claim. In this lesson, we'll talk about how insurers can get additional protection under excess and umbrella policies. Liability losses are an inherent risk that comes with doing business, but it can be quite difficult to measure your total maximum exposure for liability claims. For property damage claims, your maximum exposure, or the maximum amount you could stand to lose, is the total value of all your property. But for liability losses, there is no limit really to how much damage or injury you could potentially cause, or how much a court could award against you. Most insurers won't offer policy limits of more than $1 million per occurrence for liability losses under other types of insurance. An insured can get additional liability protection by buying an excess or umbrella policy, whose liability coverage would stack on top of the liability coverage you would get under a CGL policy, a commercial auto policy, and any other primary policies that do provide liability coverage. The excess or umbrella policy's liability coverage will layer or stack on top of the insured's primary layer of coverage or any other layers that apply. For example, let's say you have a commercial auto policy that has liability coverage for up to $1 million per occurrence and an umbrella policy that covers up to $5 million per occurrence. This means that you'd have a total of $6 million of liability coverage available for any losses that would be covered under your commercial auto policy. If you had an auto liability loss of $3 million, the general auto policy would pay the first $1 million up to its policy limit, and then the umbrella policy would kick in to pay the remaining $2 million owed on the claim. Now, the primary coverage layer that an excess or umbrella policy would sit on top of is usually the liability coverage provided by an underlying policy. For customers who are self-insured and do not have another policy that applies, which are usually large companies that are financially stable, the insured would have to pay out of pocket for the primary layer amount before the excess or umbrella policy's coverage would kick in. Excess and umbrella policies can also be stacked on top of an underlying policy's aggregate limit. In contrast to per occurrence limits, which apply per claim or per loss, the aggregate limit represents the maximum amount the insurer will pay over all claims during the policy period. In other words, once an insured's total claims paid so far during the policy effective dates reaches the aggregate limit amount, the insurer is no longer obligated to pay for any claims, period. Now, in terms of how excess and umbrella policies differ, an excess policy will only provide excess liability coverage for the same exposures that are addressed by the underlying policies. In other words, if a claim would not be considered a covered loss under any of the underlying policies, then the excess policy would not apply. On top of that, an excess policy might not pay for excess defense costs either. An umbrella policy will also cover the same exposures addressed by the underlying policies, but it also provides coverage for some additional exposures as well, subject to the umbrella policy's policy terms and policy limits. This means that the umbrella policy does cover certain types of losses that don't have a primary policy that applies. For claims like that, where there is no primary policy that's applicable, the insured is responsible for a self-insurance retention, also known as an SIR for short. To illustrate how that works, let's say you have a $5 million umbrella policy with a $100,000 SIR. This means that you would have to pay the first $100,000 of a claim before the umbrella policy kicks in to provide up to $5 million of coverage for those claims where no primary policy applies. Keep in mind that for any claims where a self-insurance retention applies, the insured is on their own for handling, processing, and defending any claims that fall under the retention amount. The insurer will only get involved for claims that exceed the self-insurance retention. One more difference between excess and umbrella policies that is worth noting has to do with defense costs. Umbrella policies do typically cover defense costs, but that isn't necessarily true of excess policies.